In October 1962, Soviet Colonel Oleg Penkovsky sat in a Moscow prison cell, waiting to be executed for treason. He knew he was going to die. What he didn't know was that his espionage had just prevented World War III. The intelligence he'd passed to the West was, at that very moment, being used by President John F. Kennedy to navigate the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest humanity has ever come to nuclear annihilation. Penkovsky's story begins not with betrayal, but with belief. In the 1950s, he was a true believer in communism, a decorated Soviet military intelligence officer with an impeccable record. But belief is a fragile thing, and once it cracks, it shatters completely. Born in 1919 in the Caucasus region of Russia, Oleg Vladimirovich Penkovsky grew up in the chaos of the Russian Civil War. His father, a white Russian officer, was eliminated by the Bolsheviks when Oleg was just a child. In Soviet Russia, having a counter-revolutionary father was a stain that never washed clean, a secret shame that had to be hidden. Young Oleg hid it well. He joined the Komsomol youth organization, studied engineering, and in 1937 entered the Kiev Artillery School. He was bright, dedicated, and crucially, he never mentioned his father's service to the White Army. On paper, he was the perfect Soviet officer. During World War II, Penkovsky served with distinction on multiple fronts. He was wounded twice, earned commendations, and proved himself a capable officer under fire. After the war, his obvious intelligence and linguistic skills caught the attention of the GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence. They recruited him in 1949. For the next decade, Penkovsky was exactly what the GRU wanted: loyal, competent, and ambitious. He rose through the ranks, gaining access to increasingly sensitive information. He traveled abroad on official business. He studied rocket technology and nuclear strategy. He became a Soviet insider with access to some of the USSR's most closely guarded secrets. But something was changing inside Oleg Penkovsky. The first crack appeared in 1955 during a posting in Turkey. Penkovsky saw how people lived in the West, not the propaganda version fed to Soviet citizens, but the reality. Ordinary people had freedoms and opportunities that didn't exist in the USSR. They could speak their minds without fear. They could travel. They could live without the constant weight of state surveillance. More troubling to Penkovsky was what he was learning about Soviet military capabilities. The propaganda claimed the USSR was matching or surpassing the West in military technology. The classified reports Penkovsky read told a different story. The Soviet military was years behind in many areas, desperately trying to catch up and lying to the world about its capabilities. The biggest lie was about nuclear missiles. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was engaged in what would later be called nuclear bluff, claiming the USSR had vast numbers of intercontinental ballistic missiles that could strike anywhere in the United States. In reality, the Soviet ICBM program was plagued with problems. Many of the missiles didn't work. Others couldn't reach their targets. The few that did function were so unreliable they could barely be considered combat-ready. But the West didn't know this. American intelligence believed Soviet claims of missile superiority. The missile gap became a political issue in the United States, with politicians demanding increased defense spending to counter the Soviet threat. Penkovsky knew the truth, and it terrified him. Not because the Soviets were weak, though they were. What terrified Penkovsky was that the Soviet leadership knew they were weak and were compensating with increasingly reckless behavior. They were taking risks, making threats, engaging in brinkmanship that could accidentally trigger a war that neither side could win. In 1960, Penkovsky made his decision. He would betray his country to save it, and the world, from its own leadership. His first attempt to make contact with the West was almost comically bungled. In August 1960, while part of a Soviet trade delegation in Turkey, Penkovsky tried to pass a letter to American students in a nightclub. The students, thinking he was drunk or trying to entrap them, ignored him. Penkovsky left the club convinced he'd blown his only chance. But he tried again and again. Each attempt was terrifying. Soviet intelligence had informants everywhere. One wrong word, one suspicious action, and Penkovsky would disappear into the Gulag system, if he was lucky. If he wasn't lucky, he'd face a firing squad. In April 1961, Penkovsky finally made successful contact with British intelligence through a British businessman named Greville Wynne, who was visiting Moscow. The meeting was arranged to look like ordinary business networking, two men discussing potential trade opportunities over dinner. What actually happened was that Penkovsky handed over the initial package of intelligence that would make him one of the most valuable spies in history. The British, suspicious of a walk-in Soviet colonel offering secrets, initially wondered if Penkovsky was a plant, a disinformation agent sent by the KGB to feed them false intelligence. They set up elaborate tests, asking questions they already knew the answers to, checking Penkovsky's information against other sources. Everything checked out. Penkovsky was legitimate. More than legitimate, he was a goldmine. He had access to technical specifications for Soviet missiles, strategic military plans, and most critically, he understood the psychology and decision-making process of Soviet leadership. He knew who was rational, who was reckless, and who was likely to push the button if a crisis erupted. The CIA and MI6 jointly ran Penkovsky as an agent, with Greville Wynne serving as one of his primary contacts. They gave Penkovsky the codename Hero, a designation that would prove prophetic. Over the next 18 months, Penkovsky provided over 5,000 photographs of classified documents and hundreds of pages of technical analysis. He used a Minox camera small enough to conceal in his hand, photographing documents in his office, in his apartment, sometimes in bathrooms during meetings when he could steal a few minutes alone. The intelligence was staggering in its value. Penkovsky provided complete technical specifications for Soviet ballistic missiles, including their range, payload capacity, and most importantly, their weaknesses and failure rates. Details about Soviet nuclear warhead designs and production capacity. Information about Soviet air defense systems, including their coverage gaps and limitations. Strategic military plans for potential operations in Europe. But most valuable of all was Penkovsky's assessment of Soviet leadership psychology and decision-making. He provided detailed personality profiles of Khrushchev and other Kremlin officials, explaining how they thought, what they feared, and how they were likely to respond to different situations. This psychological intelligence would prove crucial in October 1962. Penkovsky knew the risks he was taking. Soviet counterintelligence, the KGB's second chief directorate, was among the most effective security services in the world. They watched everyone, trusted no one, and had informants everywhere. It was only a matter of time before they noticed something. The strain on Penkovsky was immense. He was living a triple life: loyal Soviet officer, devoted family man, and traitor to the state. Each of these identities required constant performance. One slip, one moment of inattention, and everything would collapse. In his communications with his handlers, Penkovsky was increasingly fatalistic. "I know how this ends," he wrote in one message. "I will be caught eventually. They always catch spies. But if I can give you enough information to prevent a war, then my life will have meant something." By mid-1962, Soviet counterintelligence was closing in. They didn't know Penkovsky was a spy yet, but they knew something was wrong. There were too many coincidences, too many small irregularities in his behavior. They began surveillance, watching his movements, monitoring his contacts. Penkovsky knew he was being watched. He continued passing intelligence anyway, understanding that each transmission might be his last. He became more reckless, taking greater chances, as if he wanted to transmit everything he knew before they arrested him. Then came October 1962, and everything Penkovsky had warned about came true. Soviet Premier Khrushchev, attempting to counter American military superiority and protect the Castro regime in Cuba, secretly deployed nuclear missiles to the island, just 90 miles from Florida. American U-2 reconnaissance flights discovered the missiles on October 14, 1962. President Kennedy faced an impossible choice. If he did nothing, Soviet nuclear missiles would be permanently stationed on America's doorstep. If he invaded Cuba or bombed the missile sites, the Soviets might respond with nuclear weapons. If he blockaded Cuba, the Soviets might see it as an act of war. Every option led toward nuclear confrontation. This is where Penkovsky's intelligence became crucial. The CIA briefed Kennedy using Penkovsky's detailed information about Soviet missile capabilities. They knew exactly what types of missiles were in Cuba, medium-range R-12 ballistic missiles. They knew how long it took to make them operational. They knew their range, their accuracy, and, critically, their limitations. More importantly, they knew from Penkovsky that Soviet missile crews were not as well trained as Soviet propaganda claimed. The missiles had to be carefully aligned and calibrated, a process that took time. American reconnaissance could detect when missiles were being made ready to launch, giving Kennedy warning if the Soviets decided to escalate. Penkovsky's intelligence about Soviet leadership psychology was equally valuable. He'd explained that Khrushchev was a gambler who respected strength but would back down if given a face-saving way out. This influenced Kennedy's decision to impose a naval quarantine, a blockade by another name, rather than immediately invading Cuba, giving Khrushchev time to reconsider while maintaining American resolve. For 13 days in October 1962, the world held its breath while American and Soviet leaders played nuclear chess. Soviet ships approached the quarantine line. American forces went to DEFCON 2, the highest alert level before nuclear war. B-52 bombers armed with nuclear weapons circled in the sky, ready to strike Soviet cities. Submarine commanders carried orders to launch nuclear torpedoes if communications with Moscow were lost. They'd arrested him on October 22, 1962, right in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The timing was coincidental. The KGB had finally gathered enough evidence of his espionage and arrested him regardless of the international situation. Penkovsky knew what was coming. The KGB didn't just interrogate traitors, they broke them, systematically destroying both body and mind until subjects confessed to anything and everything. Then they were tried, convicted, and executed. But Penkovsky had already won. The intelligence was delivered. The war he'd tried to prevent was being avoided, though he couldn't know that from his cell. The interrogators wanted names. Who did he work with? Who recruited him? Who else was spying for the West? Penkovsky gave them nothing useful. He admitted his own espionage. There was no point denying it, they had evidence, but protected his contacts. Greville Wynne, Penkovsky's primary contact, was arrested as well. The British businessman was picked up by Hungarian security forces during a business trip to Budapest and handed over to the Soviets. Unlike Penkovsky, Wynne might survive if he cooperated. Penkovsky knew that and structured his confession to minimize Wynne's involvement, making it seem like Wynne was an unwitting courier who didn't know what he was carrying. Meanwhile, in Washington and Moscow, the crisis reached its climax. On October 27, 1962, remembered as Black Saturday, the situation nearly spiraled into war. A U-2 was shot down over Cuba, killing the pilot. Another U-2 accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace near Alaska, almost triggering a Soviet response. Soviet submarine B-59, out of contact with Moscow and under depth charge attack from American destroyers, nearly launched a nuclear torpedo. Only the objection of submarine officer Vasily Arkhipov prevented the launch. But Kennedy and Khrushchev, both aware of how close they were to Armageddon, pulled back from the brink. Kennedy's advisers credited Penkovsky's intelligence as crucial to the president's decision-making. They knew exactly what the Soviets had, what they could do, and what they were likely to do. That knowledge made it possible to craft a resolution. On October 28th, Khrushchev announced that Soviet missiles would be withdrawn from Cuba in exchange for an American pledge not to invade the island and a secret agreement to remove American missiles from Turkey. The crisis ended without a shot fired. Penkovsky, in his cell, learned about the resolution from his interrogators' questions. They wanted to know what intelligence he'd passed about Cuba. He realized then that his information had been used, that perhaps it had made a difference. In his final written statement before trial, he wrote, "I hope I have served the cause of peace." His trial was held in May 1963, a show trial designed to humiliate him and warn other potential traitors. Penkovsky was presented as a morally bankrupt traitor, motivated by greed and Western decadence. The prosecution called him a monster and a traitor to the motherland. The verdict was never in doubt. On May 16, 1963, Oleg Penkovsky was found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. The exact details of his execution remain classified. The official Soviet statement said he was shot by firing squad. Later rumors suggested something more theatrical, that he was burned alive in a crematorium furnace as a special punishment for treason, with high-ranking Soviet officials watching. These rumors have never been confirmed and are probably KGB disinformation designed to frighten other potential spies. What matters is that Oleg Penkovsky died for his espionage, and in dying he saved millions of lives. Greville Wynne was tried separately and sentenced to 8 years in prison. In April 1964, he was exchanged for Soviet spy Gordon Lonsdale in a prisoner swap on the Glinica Bridge between West Berlin and East Germany. Wynne wrote a book about his experiences, The Man from Moscow, which brought Penkovsky's story to public attention. The full extent of Penkovsky's intelligence contribution wasn't revealed until decades later, after the end of the Cold War and the declassification of CIA and MI6 files. When the documents were finally released, intelligence historians recognized Penkovsky as probably the single most valuable spy of the Cold War. Former CIA Director Alan Dulles, speaking privately to colleagues, called Penkovsky the spy who saved the world. It wasn't hyperbole. Without Penkovsky's intelligence, Kennedy would have been operating blind during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He wouldn't have known exactly what Soviet capabilities were. He wouldn't have understood Khrushchev's psychology. He wouldn't have had the confidence to pursue a middle course between appeasement and invasion. The crisis might have ended differently. A miscalculation, a misunderstanding, a moment of panic could have triggered nuclear war. Penkovsky's intelligence didn't prevent the crisis. That was Khrushchev's reckless gamble with Cuban missiles. But it prevented the crisis from becoming a catastrophe. Modern nuclear war simulations suggest that a full exchange in 1962 would have eliminated between 200 and 300 million people in the immediate blasts and fires. Subsequent nuclear winter effects would have caused global famine, potentially reducing human population by billions. It would have been quite literally the end of civilization. Penkovsky prevented that. Not single-handedly, Kennedy, Khrushchev, Vasily Arkhipov, and numerous other decision-makers all played crucial roles. But Penkovsky's intelligence was the foundation that made rational decision-making possible. The question that haunts Penkovsky's story is, why did he do it? Soviet propaganda claimed he was motivated by money, by Western bribes, by moral corruption. This was false. Penkovsky never asked for money. He was paid by his handlers, standard espionage practice, but financial gain was never his motivation. Some Western analysts suggested he was motivated by resentment over being passed over for promotions due to his father's white Russian background. This was partially true, but incomplete. Penkovsky did resent the Soviet system's hypocrisy, but resentment alone doesn't turn loyal officers into traitors. The truth, revealed in Penkovsky's own writings and interviews with his handlers, was more complex and more idealistic. Penkovsky believed he was preventing World War III. He saw the Soviet leadership engaging in reckless nuclear brinkmanship while claiming military superiority they didn't possess. He saw Khrushchev making threats based on bluffed capabilities, not realizing that the West might call that bluff and trigger a war the Soviets couldn't win, and that would destroy both sides. "I'm not betraying my country," Penkovsky told his British handler during one meeting. I'm trying to save it. Save it from leaders who are leading us toward annihilation. This rationalization, that betrayal in service of a higher cause is actually loyalty, is how many spies justify their actions. But in Penkovsky's case, events proved him right. His espionage did prevent catastrophe. After Penkovsky's execution, the KGB conducted an extensive damage assessment, trying to determine exactly what he'd revealed. The conclusion was devastating. Penkovsky had compromised virtually every aspect of Soviet strategic missile programs. Specifications, locations, capabilities, weaknesses, all of it was in Western hands. The KGB response was to purge Soviet intelligence agencies of anyone who might have had contact with Penkovsky or access to the information he stole. Dozens of officers were fired, arrested, or quietly reassigned. The paranoia lasted for years, with every intelligence failure blamed on possible additional moles. But the real damage wasn't to Soviet intelligence, it was to Soviet credibility. The West now knew that Soviet claims of military superiority were largely fiction. The missile gap was a myth. Soviet strategic forces were formidable but not overwhelming. This knowledge fundamentally changed the dynamics of the Cold War. In 1964, Khrushchev was removed from power, partly due to his handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis. His successors, Leonid Brezhnev and Alexei Kosygin, took a more cautious approach to nuclear brinkmanship. The era of direct Soviet-American confrontations largely ended. The Cold War continued, but the existential risk of nuclear war diminished significantly. Penkovsky's widow, Vera, and his daughters lived under KGB surveillance for years after his execution. They were social pariahs in Soviet society, marked by their association with a traitor. Vera eventually divorced Penkovsky posthumously, a legal fiction allowed by Soviet courts to distance families from condemned traitors. His daughters grew up never really knowing their father, knowing only the official version: traitor, spy, enemy of the people. It wasn't until the 1990s, after the Soviet Union's collapse, that they learned the full story of what their father had done. In 1990, one of Penkovsky's daughters gave an interview to a Russian newspaper. "For years I was ashamed of my father," she said. "I was taught he was a traitor, a monster. Now I learn he was trying to prevent a nuclear war. I don't know how to feel about that. Proud, sad, both?" The British and American governments quietly honored Penkovsky posthumously. A memorial plaque at CIA headquarters lists him among the agency's heroes. MI6, which traditionally never acknowledges agents, made a rare exception, with a former chief publicly stating that Penkovsky's intelligence was instrumental in resolving the Cuban Missile Crisis. In Russia, opinions on Penkovsky remain divided. To some, he's still a traitor who betrayed his country's secrets to the enemy. To others, especially younger Russians who grew up after the Cold War, he's a complex figure who made an impossible choice in impossible circumstances. Modern intelligence analysts still study Penkovsky's case as a textbook example of espionage tradecraft. His use of dead drops, his compartmentalization of information, his ability to maintain his cover under intense pressure, all of it is taught in intelligence training courses worldwide. But the most important lesson from Penkovsky's story isn't about spycraft. It's about moral courage and the burden of conscience. Penkovsky knew the consequences of his actions. He knew he'd be caught eventually. He knew what the KGB did to traitors. He did it anyway because he believed correctly that preventing nuclear war was worth any personal cost. He was right. In October 1962, when Kennedy and Khrushchev stood at the edge of the abyss, Penkovsky's intelligence helped pull them back. His espionage gave Kennedy the confidence to take risks for peace, knowing exactly what the Soviets could and couldn't do. The world never had a nuclear war. Cities weren't vaporized. Hundreds of millions of people who might have died in atomic fire lived out their lives in peace. That's Penkovsky's legacy. All the horrors that didn't happen, all the deaths that never occurred. We'll never know exactly how close we came to annihilation in October 1962. Some historians estimate we were minutes away. Others suggest hours or days. But everyone agrees that without Penkovsky's intelligence, Kennedy's decision-making during the crisis would have been far more dangerous and far less informed. Oleg Penkovsky died in 1963, executed as a traitor by the country he'd tried to save. He never received public recognition for what he'd done. He never saw the Cold War end peacefully. He never knew with certainty that his sacrifice had mattered, but it did matter. Every person alive today who might have died in a nuclear war that never happened owes something to Oleg Penkovsky. He gave everything to prevent a catastrophe that most people don't even know almost occurred. There's a photograph of Penkovsky from 1962, taken just months before his arrest. He's in his Soviet colonel's uniform, medals on his chest, looking directly at the camera with an expression that's hard to read. Pride, fear, resignation? Probably all three. Pride in his service, fear of what was coming, resignation to his fate. But if you look closely at that photograph, knowing what you know now, you can see something else. You can see a man who made the hardest choice anyone can make, to betray everything he'd been taught to believe in, order to protect something larger than himself or his country. You can see a man who chose peace over loyalty, humanity over patriotism, survival over honor. You can see a spy who saved the world.